All right, hello guys. So today we are going to continue factoring, but if you are a person who likes shortcuts, this is going to be the day for you because we are going to take a day or two and talk about what are some special cases that I can recognize where I don't actually have to draw out the X and do all the factoring. What are some shortcuts there? Okay? But before we get started, I just want to remind you when you hear me to say the word degree, the word degree is not just something you get when you graduate. The word degree, in this case, refers to the biggest exponent in your equation. So in example A, the first equation would have degree 2. The second equation would have degree 4 because of their biggest exponent. Okay? So another couple words that you need to recognize, you're going to hear me say the words sum and difference a lot. Hopefully you recognize those at least. If I'm talking about the word difference, I am talking about a subtraction problem. And that's where we're going to start. So the first thing I notice when I look at example A, both of these have minus signs. The other thing I notice is when I look at both numbers in the equations, they both have square roots. When that happens, that is what is called a difference of squares, and there is a shortcut for factoring it. Here's how you factor it. You go ahead on the first one and you draw out your two parentheses. Okay? Look up front, you've got a 16. So I say to myself, well, what's the square root of 16? That's 4. So in the front of each parentheses, I'm going to have a 4. Okay. The next thing I see is an x squared, and I say, well, how can I split that in two? Well, if I've got two x's, then each parentheses is going to get 1. Okay. Then I go to the number at the end. It's a 4. Well, the square root of 4 happens to be 2. So each parentheses is going to get a 2. Okay. Because of that minus sign in the middle, the only way for me to be able to multiply this back out and get back to a negative 4 is if one of the parentheses has a positive 2 and the other one has a negative 2. There's my factors right there. All I did was take the square root of everything and I was done. I didn't have to draw out the x's, nothing like that. There's my factors. If I wanted to go ahead and solve it, I'm looking for where this thing equals 0. So I'm solving exactly the same way I did yesterday. I'm taking each piece and setting it equal to 0. So if I solve the first piece here, I subtract 2 and divide by 4. And when you reduce that, that reduces to negative 1/2. Okay? I'm going to get something very similar on the next piece. The only thing that's different about how I solve the second piece is I add the 2 and divide by 4. Well, 2 over 4 reduces to positive 1/2. And that's the way that a difference of squares answer should always look. One will be positive, one will be negative. Let's say I go to the second part of example A. Only thing that's different is I have an x to the 4th. I pretty much am going to factor the same way except for one little thing. Okay? I draw out my parentheses. I notice they all have square roots, so I start by taking square roots. 16, its square root is 4. So I put a 4 up front. The only part that is different is when I get to the x to the 4th and I say, well, how can I split it in half? Well, when I split that in half, I get 2 and 2. So the first parentheses gets 2 x's, and the second parentheses gets 2 x's. Okay? Now for my last piece, I have a 4. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, so each parentheses gets a 2. And my signs are exactly the same as they were in the first one, plus and minus. There's my factors. The only thing that changed was I now have an x squared in the parentheses. If I wanted to solve these, I can do that. I can take each piece and set it equal to 0. So if I start to solve these on the first one, the first thing that I would do is to subtract 2 and divide by 4. Your very last step here would be to take the square root. want you to notice something here. First of all, I've got a negative inside of a square root, which means I've got a little I there. Okay. The other thing I want you to notice, one of these numbers actually does have a square root. 4, the square root is 2. So I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of the bottom and just leave the top alone. Okay, the top doesn't have a square root, but the bottom does. There's my answer. Then I go to my second piece. I start by adding the 2 and dividing by 4. Okay. And again, my very last step is to square root, and I notice, hey, 4 has a square root. It's 2. So your final answer, you leave the 2 on top inside the square root, but you go ahead and take the square root of 4 because I know what the square root of 4 is. I can simplify that. And then you're done right there. So I started with an x to the 4th. I ended up with 4 total answers, just like I should have. Okay? So one last thing we're going to talk about today, and it is very, very similar to what we just did, and that is a sum of squares. So sum means addition. So if you look at the equation, everything in it has a square root, but it has a plus sign. Here's what changes. Okay? You start off exactly the same way. You say, okay, what's the square root of 9? Well, that's 3. So each parentheses gets a 3. If I split up x squared and I split that in half, each parentheses gets an x. I then say, what is the square root of 64? That's an 8. And my signs are plus minus. Here is the difference. When you factor a sum of squares, this second number right here has an I with it. So it's not just 3x plus 8 and 3x minus 8. It's 3x plus 8i and 3x minus 8i. Okay? So there's my factors for a sum of squares. That is literally the only difference. So if I wanted to solve this right here, I take each piece, set it equal to 0. Well, the first thing I would do is, on the first one, subtract 8i to the other side. Okay. And then I would divide by 3. So your answer there is negative 8i over 3. And it's acceptable to leave your answer like that. You don't have to do anything else to it. If I solve the second piece, I'm going to start by adding 8i and then dividing by 3. There's my second answer right there. Okay? So it is okay that you have an I in your answer. That's fine. Let's say I look at the second equation here. The only thing, again, that is different is now I have an x to the 4th. So I'm going to start out by factoring. I say, okay, both of these numbers have a square root. Well, the square root of 9 is 3. If I split x to the 4th in half, I get an x squared in each parentheses. And I know because I see a plus here, this is a sum of cubes, I can't just write that the square root of 64 is 8. That 8 has to have an I with it. And my signs are always plus minus. There's my factoring, and I will never ask you to solve that one because it gets a little bit messy. What I need you to be able to do on these is to tell me how to get this far. Okay? So just a couple of reminders. If I ever see a sum of cubes, which means there's a plus sign in the middle, I'm going to have an I in my parentheses. Okay? If you see an x to the 4th, make sure when you write your 2 parentheses that there's an x squared in each one of them. Okay? So go ahead. Today's practice does involve working with a partner. So find someone around you that you can work with. Make sure you follow the instructions carefully. You're going to be writing your own sum and difference of squares equations and having your partner solve them. All right, guys. Have a good day.